Session title, How Do We Know What Works? Challenges and Opportunities for Building Evidence for Practitioners.
Hi, welcome back. As a reminder, if you need assistance during the session, the help desk is available. And please note that the handouts for today's sessions are available to download from the handouts window. I'm Jennifer Haight. I'm at the Children's Bureau, relatively new there, where my job is to monitor state child welfare system performance. Before coming to the Children's Bureau, I worked at the Chapin Hall Center for Children, where I did a lot of work with the Center for State Child Welfare Data, working with various jurisdictions, supporting them in their efforts to gather and use evidence to help them make decisions which involve the way they serve children and families in the child welfare system. Today, there's a group of us are talking specifically about how to be effective, focused specifically on those of us on the front line. In our business, in the work that we do, people on the front line have a very, very difficult job. They are called upon on a daily basis to make observations, to assess, to evaluate, and to process complex situations, and then make and execute decisions, sometimes very hard ones, that will inevitably have a very direct consequence on a child and on a family. We are depending on these workers to make good, defensible decisions that set up families for future success. And we are depending on them to do that work with kindness, with humanity, with respect for the families and with the partners with whom they're engaging. We also are counting on them to document all of their decisions, all of their activities. That is, not only use evidence, but contribute to the building the evidence base for others. Doing these tasks well calls on a suite of skills that are not overlapping, that are somewhat complementary, and that require us to support our workers in developing. We can't dictate, and we shouldn't say specifically how a worker should interact with a family, but we can help them make the best use of their judgment, the best use of common sense, the best use of the evidence available to them so that they can connect effectively with families and work together with them to jointly arrive at decisions that are going to set them up for future success. That's our job. This session is meant to explore those ideas. How are we going to do our job? We're going to start with me providing sort of a brief overview of what we mean about evidence and how to use it in our effort to learn something about the systems in which we're taking action. And then we'll move to others in the field who will speak more specifically about how they do their jobs to support everyone in having the information they need and the skills and abilities that are required in order for them to do their jobs well. So I want to start first by just answering the question which everyone may have, what is evidence? Well, I use that word evidence instead of data and sometimes instead of knowledge, but really what it is it's simply the development of information into knowledge that can be brought to bear when you are trying to make a decision, make an observation, diagnose a problem, propose a solution, evaluate a circumstance, decide to do something different. And evidence itself, at least the way I construct it, can be acquired in a number of different ways. You can generate it yourself. You can be a scientist or a reviewer or somebody who generates information from the assets that are available to them. Or you can acquire it. You can use the evidence that somebody else generated. You can look to the research community and use that evidence. It can be either quantitative or it can be qualitative. What's particularly essential is that it's generated through a rigorous scientific process so that the evidence, qualitative or quantitative, wherever you get it or however you make it, is developed adhering to the best practice principles in measurement. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. I want to note that sometimes evidence is generated through a rigorous evaluation, and that kind of evidence, the study of intervention or a program or something that a state or a community is trying to do to promote a specific outcome, when they are rigorously done, they contribute to the evidence base. An evidence-based practice is one that has been tested scientifically so that you can say unequivocally that the initiative or the intervention has had a positive impact on its intended population. You can also generate or build evidence through the practice of CQI. Through a lot of the work that we do at the Children's Bureau is at the federal level, but it is part of the process of building evidence. We go out, we collect information from child welfare systems, either through the administrative data record, or through case reviews, or through interviews, or through the state's own assessment of their own performance. All of that is deployed in the effort to learn something and to do something different, and it's part of the evidence building and development process. And finally, caseworkers on the line. All of the work, in fact, that I do depends on the work that they do to build the evidence base. If you're a worker, you're entering data into the case record. That data goes into the administrative data, it goes into the narrative, and both of those sources, along with your own perspectives on the work you do with children and families, that contributes to the evidence base that we all use when we're trying to make decisions to either do more of an effective practice or do something different to get better outcomes for children and families. So that's a lot of evidence, and there are a lot of different ways it can be deployed to help us do our jobs better. I just want to talk about two practices or behaviors, well, practices, that I think are really important in the effort to use this evidence to support good decisions. First of all, I think you have to know what you want to know. Know your question. What do you want to know? In my job, there are a lot of things that I want to know, that I'm required to know. I want to know about processes, I want to know about quality, I want to know about whether state systems are functioning to produce outcomes. I want to know if workforces are set up so that they can execute their jobs well, if they have training. That's a lot of information. I also want to know about outcomes. Are the processes and the quality of care and the capacity that these systems have to execute those processes, are they producing an effect? So although I want to know about all of those questions, I also know that when I want to seek an answer, I have to match the question I have to the data I have and to a method that's going to generate a good answer. So when it comes to outcomes, which are sort of the thing that we all turn to eventually when we're wanting to know whether something works, whether we're being effective, there are a couple of things that I would recommend, that I have for years been recommending, that individuals and systems do. Ask a good question and then answer the question by selecting a representative population. If you want to know about an outcome in the child welfare system, make sure that you query every child or family that has the opportunity to experience that outcome. And make sure that the statistic or the number that you produce to answer that question is in fact represents the proportion of kids or families who had that outcome. It sounds really straightforward. It often isn't. But if you don't pick the sample to match your question, you might not get useful data. The thing that we really want to do is use these data to build our knowledge to make better decisions. I have a lot of other advice that I'm happy to share in different formats about what you do to make further use of that data. And at the Children's Bureau, it's part of my job to continue to build the evidence base so that we have measures that adhere to the best practice principles and measurement that systems and the individuals within them can use. But at the end of the day, as I said before, a couple of things. First of all, we depend on individuals in the systems to help generate the evidence case by case that we use to understand outcomes. I also want to note that as important as that is, there are limitations. We can't know everything. We sometimes don't know what we don't know. We sometimes don't have the data we need and need to in order to make a decision. And in those cases, we need to move on. And I think that the way that we can address these limitations is creating a culture in which decision makers at any level of the organization are supported in developing behaviors that will help them be good critical thinkers, that will encourage them to ask questions and to pay attention to the answers, to make decisions on the basis of the information they have, and document them so that we can learn from those decisions. The next couple of speakers are going to talk a little bit more about that, because in each of their roles, they're doing just that. They're generating evidence and they're using it to make decisions that affect the lives of children and families in the communities where they work.
Segment title, How Do We Know What Works? Individual Perspectives. Margo Fudge, County of San Diego, California, Health and Human Services Agency, Child Welfare Services.
Hello, my name is Margo Fudge. I'm the Acting Deputy Director for the County of San Diego Child Welfare Services, specifically over policy and program support and a number of other programs. So I'm here today to talk about how in our county we have really embraced a culture that looks for evidence and the use of data in our practice. So we've long since had a deep-rooted belief in the need to use research evidence and data to inform our practice. So for the past at least 10 years, we've involved all levels of staff in what these practices look like. One of the things that's been very successful for us in San Diego County is the use of Safe Measures. Safe Measures is a wonderful tool that we use at all levels, from line staff to supervisors and managers, and even our director, to look at how we're doing, what our compliance looks like. This tool allows staff to see almost in real time how they're doing with a variety of measures, specifically their monthly contacts with children, their medical and dental outcomes, timeliness to investigation, all things that are really important to ensure that we're meeting mandates and giving families the best possible outcomes. What we've also done is a recent partnership with the University of California, San Diego, which is called our CAPTURE program, and that stands for the Community and Academic Partnership for the Translational Use of Research Evidence. And so this partnership has been pretty unique for us in that working with the academic community has allowed us to really look at things differently and how we can use research evidence to inform our practice. So we've worked with all levels of staff and convened focus groups where we have the researchers asking questions. How can we make the practice better? We have really heard from our staff about what they feel like the system needs to be able to have better outcomes for children and families. One of the areas we're focusing on is teaming. We've heard that outcomes tend to be better for children and families when there's a teaming approach. So we're really looking at how we can have staff that partner with one another to cover when somebody's on vacation or out on unexpected leave, have a shared responsibility for decision making, and really just that overall accountability is really helpful for staff. We're also looking at paperwork. We know that in this field it's extremely heavy with paperwork, and that this can be really difficult for staff to have the time to be out in the community with the families that they need to serve when they're at their desk doing paperwork. So one of the things we're looking at is the streamlining and elimination of duplication of paperwork, as well as creating smart forms, which will really help the staff complete them in a much more timely manner. We think that this will help reduce burnout among staff and ultimately get them out into the field to work with the families. Lastly, we're looking at a referral process whereby staff can put in some limited information about a family they're working with, and they will then have a menu of services that would benefit that family. In a county as large as San Diego, geographically as well as demographically, it's oftentimes hard to know what is the best service for that particular family. Each case may be different, or perhaps you're working in a remote area where services are limited. This would allow them to know on any given day what organization is currently serving that population and who the best person to turn to is. So again, we think this is something that could really help our staff and improve outcomes for the families that they're working with. In addition, we have a continuous quality improvement unit that's now been up and running for about 15 years. We were very eager to start this unit back in about 2005, and this unit provides a vital support to staff and ultimately ensuring that we're providing the best service to families possible. So we have 2 full units of senior level staff that do case reviews, they look at trends and outcomes, and they're attached to our data unit, which runs monthly reports, quarterly reports, and annual reports. They do 30 monthly reports that they provide to all levels of staff to help them remain knowledgeable about what trends we're seeing so that we can shift our practice accordingly. They also do 170 ad hoc reports annually, which speaks to the volume of requests that we receive, so that we're always looking at ways we can improve our practice. I think one thing that's important when we're talking about data is that I've heard in countless meetings, probably every meeting I attend where we're talking about some sort of data type question, is all levels of staff comment, well, I don't do math, that's why I'm a social worker. And I think that for many of us that are in this field, we're highly intelligent people who have one, if not more, degrees. And I think social workers and child welfare staff need to give themselves more credit for what data really looks like and their role. As was discussed earlier, data doesn't have to just be the crunching of numbers and looking at spreadsheets. Data could mean a number of different things. And our staff on a daily basis contribute to what that evidence and what that data is. So I think just reminding people how important their role is in creating data is really important. About a year and a half ago in San Diego, we took on a project that we called our Long Stayers project. And this was a really successful use of data for us. We historically had looked at the length of time that children were in the system, but we weren't specifically looking at how long they were in the adoptions program. And what we found in pulling that data specifically was that we had about 700 children in the adoptions program, and about 80 of them had been in the program past the termination of parental rights, but were not moving towards a finalized adoption. And for these 80 children, they had been in care for greater than 3 years past the termination of parental rights. And so for these children, we were able to look on a monthly basis by pulling the data, talking to the staff, talking to the supervisors, and finding out what those barriers are to permanency. As a result of these efforts, we were able to reduce that number of 80 children to about 30 in a 1 year period. We worked with a community partner, we held permanency roundtables, we did family finding. We looked at a number of different strategies for how we could reduce that number and ultimately achieve permanency for a large number of children, which that was all because of looking at the data. In summary, I think it's important to remember that while child welfare professionals have extensive education, knowledge, and training, that the true experts on families are the families themselves. And when coupled with data, the voice of the family is extremely powerful. And when using the two of them together, we're likely to have successful outcomes. Thank you.
Jerry Bruce, Georgia Supreme Court Committee on Justice for Children.
Hi, I'm Jerry Bruce. I'm the Court Improvement Program Director for the state of Georgia and a former juvenile court judge. So I have a lot of experience using data. In fact, I didn't know anything about the existence of child welfare data for the first 10 years or so of my experience in the child welfare system. I was working as a state child welfare agency attorney and in a couple of different judicial circuits, and the way we decided whether we were doing a good job or not was sort of just by feel. You know, sometimes we felt unreasonably optimistic and sometimes we felt unreasonably pessimistic. It was difficult to know when we were right. So most of the time we just defaulted to unreasonably optimistic. We felt that most of the time we were doing a really good job for the children and families in front of us without any real evidentiary basis for that. The interesting thing was that we had the same kind of outcomes in the same kind of cases again and again and again because we had no objective measures to check ourselves against. So I was very excited when I became a judge and I was first introduced to child welfare data. I thought, this is a game changer. This is going to change the way we look at things because now we have some objective measures against which to measure our efforts and to talk about this, to give context to the work that we do. So I have become a real devotee and believer in the use of data and to inform our work. In fact, my agency funds most of the child welfare training and education that goes on in Georgia, and all of the training and education that we fund has to have a data component where we talk about statewide data, national data, and the individual drill down data from the jurisdictions that we're doing the training in if it's not a statewide training. And this is a really useful thing to do because it helps to ground the work that the people are doing in the jurisdictions, give them comparison, larger comparison, and helps them to set their expectations against that. The only other thing I'd say about evidence is to give evidence and data its proper context. I've gone completely over to a model of multidisciplinary training because I found that when you bring data to an isolated, siloed group, they look at the data and they blame everybody else who's not in the room for the outcome of the data. Like pretty much everybody blames the Child Welfare Agency for most of the ills that they find. But this goes on repeatedly. When you have everybody in the room together and you have the judge in the room together or a group of judges, you have the Child Welfare Agency, not just the frontline staff workers who make the immediate decisions, but the people who review those decisions all the way up to state policy level people. And then you have all classes of attorneys who represent all the different parties involved. You have CASAs and other guardians ad litem there, and even service providers. A lot of time you lay this data out there and there's really nowhere to hide. You've got to have a really interesting and honest conversation about the kind of work you're doing in the jurisdictions. I think it's very natural for people to want to sort of evade responsibility sometimes for these decisions that we make because they're really important decisions and a lot rides on them. But I use a sort of medical example when I talk about how useful data can be. I would say, well, just imagine, not just data, but multidisciplinary training. Imagine that your doctor sends you to a surgeon for a consultation. This is a really important decision, right? Am I going to have surgery or not? And your surgeon looks at you and says, well, you know, usually when I get a case like this is what I do. Now, I'm not going to look at the notes from your treating physician. I'm not going to look at the x-rays. I'm not going to look at the blood work because I have a real feel for how this should go, and I'm going to start on surgery. You know, you'd probably run screaming from the office. But very often we have a lot of data we can pull in. We have other stakeholders we can talk to, and yet we content ourselves with a siloed, contextless approach to the work that we do. And using multidisciplinary training with a sort of rich source of data really helps to set forward the work we do. So that's the context in which we use data. But I want to talk about some of the specific instances. I said that I'm only funding multidisciplinary trainings at this point. One of those is a 2-day deep dive in local jurisdictions into every aspect of their policy, practice, and procedures. And we begin each one of those 2-day sessions with a really detailed hour-long, sometimes longer than an hour, discussion of the specifics of their child welfare data. How are they doing on all the markers for child welfare data? How many children are they investigating? How many children that are investigated or substantiated? What percentage of substantiated victims do they remove? I find that actually giving these sorts of data presentation actually creates conversations. It's not a static presentation where one person gives data. Because I always tell the stakeholders that I'm training, you know, I can tell you what your data look like, but I can't tell you why they look the way they do. And all of a sudden a conversation starts. Because I ask, you know, so a year ago your percentage of substantiated victims who were removed was this. And this year it's a lot bigger. What's happened in the last 12 months so that you're removing more substantiated victims than you did a year ago? And that starts a conversation. Everybody in the room sort of looks at one another, and then some brave soul raises his or her hand, and an explanation is proffered. And then somebody else has something to offer. And pretty soon, you're not just presenting data, you're having a live conversation about the actual state of your child welfare system that's driven by the data. So this is a really important thing. One of the other ways that we've used data to really change outcomes in the work we do is through something we call the cold case project, which is related to what Margo talked about with her long stayers. We take, twice a year, we take an algorithm and we look at all the children in care in our state. And we look for things like children who have been in care for a long time and who are not in a permanent placement. Usually that means they're in a non-relative foster home. We look for high per diem rates, special needs, all kinds of difficulties that might be causing these children to be stuck in foster care with no appropriate permanency outcome. And then we bring together a team of experts who are led by attorneys who are certified child welfare law specialists. We also have doctors and pharmacists and behavioral health people who sit and help us to look through these cases. Then we go take that information to the individual jurisdiction where those children's cases are, one at a time, with the families present, with the caseworkers present, with the lawyers present, the guardians ad litem, anybody who can help, even relatives, friends, clergymen, just anybody we can get at the table, and we try and really bust through the difficulties that are keeping those children from achieving permanency. One of the things we find when we do this is that very often our data show that we're not actually making very full use of the relative search information at the beginning of the case, or that we made use of it at the beginning of the case, and then we never had reference to it again because we thought, okay, I've checked that box, I've done that relative search, I don't have to do it anymore. But it was at one of these things where I was sitting as the cold case fellow, as the lawyer involved in the case, where someone said, you know, we don't have any relatives. We've exhausted the relatives. And a family friend said, you know, I saw the child the other day, and the child is communicating with 5 family members on Facebook. Are these people you've already looked at? And the case manager looked at the Facebook page because the child was there. None of those people were people that we had ever looked at before, and they'd never been disclosed. So suddenly we had 5 new family members because, as Margo said, we made the effort to communicate with the whole family and with the child, and we found that what on paper looked like a good, diligent relative search was actually just a sort of checking a box, and we didn't go back and look at that again. The other thing we found is that we had a mindset that said, once we've moved beyond reunification as a permanency option, then we're not going to look at family anymore. And we're not going to look at relatives because we've already exhausted all that. And we've actually found that a lot of parents who we'd written off, either because we had stopped working a reunification case plan or even after we had done termination of parental rights, had actually remediated the issues that led to the removal of their children in the beginning. Because we know a lot of these folks are dealing with intractable mental health and substance abuse problems. Sometimes you can't really, even with evidence-based services, take care of those in 15 months. And at that point, we've got a lot of pressure to begin to move towards termination of parental rights. So we find that, in fact, the parents are now capable. And we have to ask ourselves questions we never asked before. How now, in order to set forth permanency, can we think outside the box and get these children back to their parents again? Fortunately, in 2014, our state instituted a reinstatement of parental rights statute that allows us to do this. And through our cold case project, we've actually seen some reinstatements of parental rights and having children reunited with families who were utterly written off legally and factually before that happened. So that's an important way to go forward as well. The final thing that our data tells us about this sort of writing people off after they have had their rights terminated is that we make an argument to fact finders, to judges, and to ourselves that if we will terminate parental rights, we'll get children to permanency. And so I've taken a dive into the data on that in our state over the past year to look at this, and I present and train on this regularly because what I found was that a significant portion, in many jurisdictions in our state, the majority of children who've been in care for more than 24 months in a non-permanent placement, that is a non-relative foster home, are actually free for adoption. And so our data are showing us something really uncomfortable, and that is that we're not fulfilling the promise that if we would terminate parental rights, we would get these children to permanency. We're terminating them in to more long-term foster care. So our use of data has been challenging, but it started a very constructive conversation about how we should handle those cases from now on, and even a more fundamental question about whether termination of parental rights is appropriate in all the cases that we used to think it was appropriate in. So data can be very challenging, but it can also help us to see much more clearly to outcomes that really do serve children better.
Joe Walker, JBS International Incorporated.
Hi, my name is Joe Walker. I'm the Indigenous Projects Program Lead for the Center for Native Child and Family Resilience, or what we call the Center. What we're doing at the Center is we're looking at various models in Indian country in order to figure out what is the best model, what is the best practice in order to prevent maltreatment in Indian country. And so over the last year, we've conducted what's called an environmental scan, where we're looking at all the various practices, all the various models in Indian country. And then we picked 6 of those that look like that we could build further evidence around their model, around their practice, in order to replicate that practice or model throughout Indian country. And so we have 6 projects that we're working with right now, and hopefully we'll be able to get to that point within the next couple of years to actually build some evidence, maybe even build an evidence-based practice in order to replicate that again throughout Indian country. But for tribes and others have been collecting data and building evidence since the beginning of time. They've tried to figure out, okay, what are the best foods to eat? What's going to poison me? What's not going to poison me? Where can I live? Where I'll be protected from the environment and others that may not have the same values that I have. What can I drink? I mean, can I just drink any water? Or does it have to be clear? Those sorts of questions. And so what they were doing is actually gathering the evidence, testing that evidence by drinking the water, and they did not perish, and so that's the water that they should be drinking. They picked a location throughout the country and lived in that location, did not perish, and so that's where they decided to live. And so they've been doing that ever since the beginning of time. Also, that hunger for data, because they had to have that hunger for data in order to survive, but that hunger for data continues in our tribal child welfare programs today. Not only child welfare, but all the programs associated with a tribal nation. They're always trying to figure out what's the best way to provide services to our children and families, what's the best way to provide services to our elders, to our community, to our staff and the various programs within a tribal nation. And if we're meeting their need, how do we know that we're meeting their need? There's a constant hunger for data and also to build evidence so that they do not keep reinventing the wheel. And so they collect that evidence to show what works and what does not work, and so that they can make those changes that they need to make for their communities and their children and families. One of the issues that they have in Indian country is there's often a lack of staffing, there's often a lack of funding. Our social workers are usually overwhelmed, they usually have multiple roles, and so that impacts their ability to try to collect that data and build that evidence, on a day-to-day basis. Because they have too many things going on, they don't have enough staff in order to meet the need, but they still have that hunger and they still try to do their best, so they're still collecting evidence. And how do they do that? They do that in simple ways like they have case staffings around their various cases. And so they may sit there and they may talk about their case and talk about, well, this is the intervention, this is the innovation that I brought to bear or to help this family. And then somebody in the staffing may ask, well, did it work or did it not work? At that point in time, you're starting to build evidence, because if you talk about, well, it did work and this is what happened, that really proves that whatever it is that you brought to the family is actually helping that family to move forward in their lives. If you have that same question and you're asked, well, did it work or did it not work, and you do not receive a positive response, then that also tells you something. That tells you that whatever you brought to that family to help that family is not really working, and that maybe I should change what it is that I'm doing or what it is that I brought to the family. This can be done a lot of different ways. You don't have to have a big, rigorous evaluation to actually look at that kind of data. You can actually do things what they call Plan, Do, Study, Act. I was working for a grant project, and we used to call it Plan, Act, Reflect, and Adapt. But it's the same thing, where you bring an innovation or an intervention to the child and family or to the program, and you plan around that, the who, what, when, where, and how you're going to do that intervention. And then you actually do the intervention, and then you look at that and start realizing, okay, is this working for the child and family? Is it working for the program? And then if not, then what are the changes that I need to make? Did the actual intervention meet your expectations around that intervention or innovation that you brought? Or did it not? And so you make changes accordingly. That could be done from the really simple micro level questions you have or the interventions you have to the macro level interventions you have. And really how you do that is you start out simple, you get a success under your belt, and then you move to the next level. So you may have one family that you introduce to that intervention, and the next time around, if it works, or even if it didn't work, and you made changes, appropriate changes, you may bring that to 2 families. And then you just move on further and further and further until next thing you know, you have the evidence, sufficient evidence to show that, yeah, let's use this with all of our families because it seems to work. So tribes are constantly have that hunger for data, for evidence, to show that things work, interventions work, that innovations work. It's just that one of the issues that they have, like I said previously, is that the lack of funding creates lack of staffing, the overwhelming caseloads, and all of those things keeps them from doing the good work that they need to do in order to build evidence for interventions or innovations that may come to help families in the future. One final thought about what I had talked about today is the challenges around collecting data and building evidence. That's not to say that there is not innovative patches of work occurring throughout Indian country. It's just that a lot of times when I go out, and I've been doing this for 30 years, I talk to the staff, I meet with the program, and that's essentially the challenges I talked about earlier are the challenges that they told me. That's not to say that those innovative patches are not occurring throughout Indian country where good data collection and evidence building is occurring. Also, there's been some talk about, that I've heard, about rigorous evaluations do not occur in Indian country, and they do. I'm here to tell you they do because I've been involved in several of those. We just may have a different worldview of what, evidence is, what data is, and it really depends on, the wishes of the community in which we're working with, the wishes of the program, and the wishes of the tribal members that we're currently asking these questions of. And so rigorous evaluations do occur in Indian country. It's just that we have a different way of doing that. Most of it involves storytelling, and that's a technique that's been going on, again, since the beginning of time with tribes, is to tell stories about our history and what we're doing and what works and what doesn't work. And so that's a big piece of what it is that we do, and that's a big piece of what we're doing through the center.
Segment title, How Do We Know What Works? A simulated discussion. Jennifer Haight, Children's Bureau.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining me to have a conversation about sort of a sample case, one that is probably not unfamiliar to any of us who've been working in child welfare for a while. So I want to just describe the circumstances of this case and then just have a conversation about some of the decisions that were made and what could maybe have been done differently. So this is a case of a sibling group of 3, 2 girls and a boy. The youngest is the boy who's 4, and the oldest is a girl who's about 11. Her name is Sarah. Sarah and her siblings were living with their parents who disappeared for several days. And when the child welfare authorities were notified, they were removed and placed in a temporary shelter where they stayed for a few days and revealed that sometimes they were hungry, sometimes their parents went away, but they were not physically abused. So the shelter, the child welfare agency tried to find relatives. They couldn't find any. They tried to work with the parents. The parents weren't particularly cooperative. They ended up putting the 3 children in a foster home with parents who expressed interest eventually in potentially adopting them. So the 2 younger kids who were very close to their older sister settled in pretty well. But the older sister was concerned about being separated from her parents, about the possibility of not seeing them again. And she eventually started to act out in ways that escalated, both at school and in the home. And eventually, the foster parents said that they would be willing to adopt the 2 younger children, but that they were having trouble controlling Sarah, and they asked that she be removed. She was removed, this 11-year-old girl, and placed in a group home where her behaviors escalated. And even though on occasion she had some contact with her siblings, it turned out that the more that contact triggered more behavior. So ultimately, they put a break on those on the visits. Her 2 siblings were adopted by their foster parents, and she went on to move into a higher level of care, where after 40 months she remained without a permanent home, without sustained contact with anyone in her immediate family or with her siblings, or with the potential foster parents. So 40 months in, she's in this group setting, and she's experiencing increasing levels of trauma and the behavior associated with trauma. So given what we talked about earlier, I guess I just want to start out by saying that this is not an atypical story. And I'm wondering, maybe I'll start with you, Margo, what might have happened differently? What evidence could the caseworker and her supervisor have used to make different decisions for this particular case?
Right, I think this is a very common, unfortunately, a very common scenario. And in a situation like this, I would have hoped that we would build upon family engagement. We know that family engagement and visitation are two key components to successful reunification. And without more information, we're not really able to see what sort of engagement occurred with these parents. And then what that visitation looked like. This child appeared to be highly parentified and would have really needed some services to help address the trauma that she had experienced. I would have hoped that we would have done some family finding, perhaps had a permanency roundtable and bringing family members together, and really critically would have been a child and family team meeting on a regular basis. I think the voice of the child and the family is really, really important in a case like this throughout the life of the case.
Yeah. And thinking about what might have transpired in the courtroom, I mean, this case stretched on for nearly 4 years, and that would mean that there would be regular hearings, regular opportunities for the family or the sibling group and the caseworkers and any legal representatives to come into a courtroom and have conversations about what might happen next. What would you have looked for?
Jerry Bruce, Georgia Supreme Court Committee on Justice for Children.
Well, I think the first thing I would look for is the frequency and the quality of the court hearings. I mean, you can have regular court hearings and still have them infrequently. And we know that the more frequently a court touches the case, has all the parties in front of the court, and is holding the parties accountable, the better outcomes we have. And that's essential for, in a case like this, evaluating the diligence of the agency and looking for relatives and family and kin. And also in evaluating the quality of services that are being put in place for the parents. So I would want to know that all those things were being done, especially before a decision was made to file a termination of parental rights petition.
Which, based on this vignette and others like it, happened relatively quickly, it seems like, with when there were young children. I was sort of struck by, in this vignette, the child's interest in being with her parents and the role she assumed with respect to her siblings. What do you think we could have done differently here to build on the strength inherent in that and also mitigate any safety issues?
Joe Walker, JBS International Incorporated.
Well, I think right away they should have accessed Sarah, since she was the oldest and she was taking care of the siblings for quite a while anyway. So she probably had a lot of information regarding relatives and others that may be part of, the family group. They should have established family culture right away, so that way they can look at the family's beliefs, their values, and that would help them set the relationship with Sarah, as well as the other siblings as well. I think they should have, and it didn't say that in the vignette, but I think they should have looked at whether, or determined whether the family is Native or not, and if they were Native, then they would need to go through the Indian Child Welfare Act process and notify the appropriate tribe that they were taking custody of the child. So I think all of those things taken together would give them opportunities for them to search and find relatives in order to be involved in this child, in this family's life.
Right. I mean, something you said just made me think, too, about sort of paying attention to the culture of the family. Like, this was clearly not a case where there was really egregious maltreatment of the children.
Right.
They were left in circumstances that are undesirable. But again, assessing sort of the context of that family, making a point to hear their story, is not something that came through in this record, and it strikes me as, based on what we spoke about earlier, would potentially have led to a different outcome.
I think it would have been important, too, to really engage the family, the caregivers, in terms of how they were able to work with the child, with Sarah, as her needs escalated.
Right.
I think this is a pretty common scenario, especially for some of our older youth who maybe have been neglected for years. And so I think it would have been really, really important for them to engage in treatment with her. And having sent her away and then sort of being abandoned just compounds what she's already dealing with. And as you mentioned earlier, the outcomes for a child like Sarah will probably not be very favorable.
Right. I mean, so that's one of the benefits of having a conversation about a case like this, is that we can sort of look back at what I sometimes call inflection points in the trajectory of the case and realize that there were lots of opportunities to do something different. So if we weren't able to keep this sibling group in their home and they had to be removed, what might have made that a less traumatic experience for all of the children, especially Sarah. If the caregivers expressed interest in adoption, how might we have been able to support them, as you say, in including Sarah, the sibling, sort of in that opportunity to have a permanent family? So I think possibly from the bench, you are in a really good position to see the sort of the trajectory of a case unfold and understand at what opportunities at what inflection point, I guess, there's an opportunity to change the path of a case.
Yeah, one of the most important considerations in a case like that from the bench really is family time, and that's something that courts really have to insist on, and very often in courts I observe now in my current capacity, I see courts leave that decision to the state child welfare agency, and they need to really be the ones who are holding the agency responsible for valuable, appropriate family time that doesn't consist of sort of putting the parents and children together in an artificial box-like situation and turning on cameras and weird lights and observing them interact and see how they do, because they're not going to do well under those circumstances. And this child is obviously really connected with her parents, and I think family time could have resolved a lot of her issues and difficulties even while the family worked on their deficiencies.
Right. Yeah, so, and what strikes me from where I sit, because in fact in my job I don't really typically have specific cases, but I am responsible for understanding how the decisions that caseworkers make in the systems in which they work sort of aggregate up into outcomes. And knowing those outcomes helps me work with sort of my partners in the states, understand how to change them, to where do we want to do something different to change what's likely to happen. So for example, with this case, I read this, I could tell you right away based on the information that I have consumed over my 20 years working with administrative data, that children who enter the system at 11 and don't go home right away and end up in a group home, they're gonna have undesirable outcomes. Our system isn't working well with them to put them in position to help them thrive. And having that information is great. What's not great is not doing anything with it. If I can tell you that when they enter, then we shouldn't really necessarily need to have 40 months of this groove getting sort of even more embedded in our system. We have to use the aggregation of cases like this from the past to help us know what to do differently in the future, so that when this sibling group presents to a caseworker, they might do something utterly different. And the other thing, we've learned from other sessions is that we have more different things. What could the caseworkers have done in the community, for example? I think you spoke a little bit about that, and I know that you each probably have some ideas about what you would do differently from the moment this family presented to you. And it would be interesting to hear maybe a little bit more about your immediate thought. What would you have done with this sibling group?
For me, I think what I would like to see is more interaction between the case manager and Sarah, since she's the oldest of the siblings, as well as all of the siblings. More interaction, more relationship building that may have led to Sarah divulging who some of her relatives are. Maybe developing a genogram or something to elicit conversation across all the whole entire family. And I'd also want to know how attached or how connected they are to their culture in order to bring some of those elements in, such as the sweats, the powwows, the spiritual people, bring those in order to foster conversation or free up the conversation amongst the family. I think that would be beneficial to this case.
So you would have asked a lot of questions.
I would have tried to.
Yeah. And Margo, what about you?
I think those are all really good points, and how we could do a better job from the very beginning with this family in supporting them. Like we discussed, really digging deeper to find out about the relatives and supporting the parents in the process of reunification. we have a lot of great caregivers that come to this system really wanting to help support families. And so I think placing the children in a home that would have fostered that relationship with their parents, encouraging the visitation, helping with the services, I think that could have been critical to change the trajectory of this case. So I think that family strengthening component would have been very important from the beginning.
So you would have put into practice knowledge you've gained from the field that says that when caregivers work with birth families, they can sometimes promote healing and reunification.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And Jerry, what about you?
I think what Margo said about the caregivers is really important, because so often this looks like a kind of case where people decided really early on what was going to happen, regardless of what should happen. So it looks like a case where people said this is a termination of parental rights case, and that's the way we're going to move. Perhaps the caregivers could have been brought in more collaboratively to assist with the parents, to give advice to the parents, to give information to the parents about the status of the children. You know, I always find that when the caregivers are willing to communicate with the parents rather than just be sort of off-site third-party caregivers, that a whole new level of collaboration can occur. And they each help each other think of things they wouldn't have thought of before. Foster parents are less likely, caregivers are less likely to ask for termination of parental rights in those cases, and more likely to see themselves as a resource for the family rather than just a replacement for the family.
Right, so you would have also asked questions and made use of evidence, and then sort of importantly, and this sort of brings us to sort of our close, you would have done something different based on the answers to the questions and the knowledge you have. And that different act that you would have taken would have resulted in something different for this family. I think that's sort of one of the things we want to re-emphasize as we close out, is that each of us in our position in the system has an obligation and opportunity to gather evidence and to use that evidence to make decisions, and sometimes to make different decisions than you might otherwise make. That's really the only way we will see change over time. So I guess closing out, I just want to sort of make that admonition, that challenge, that no matter where we are in the system, understand we have an obligation to both use evidence and in doing so build the evidence base. And the best way to do it is to show the behaviors that we want to encourage, be curious, ask questions, listen to the answers, be open-minded, do something different as a result, and document it all so that we all have the benefit of building the evidence base and supporting others to do the same, so that we can ultimately see different outcomes for the children and the families and the communities that we're working in. Joe, Margo, Jerry, thanks so much for answering my questions, for considering this case. I appreciate it. And thanks to the audience. Thanks for coming to our session, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.
Logo for the Child Welfare Virtual Expo. Child Welfare Virtual Expo. This video was developed for the Child Welfare Virtual Expo by the Capacity Building Center for States and is sponsored by the Children's Bureau. Its content does not necessarily reflect the views and policies of the Children's Bureau.